Florida State rules the BCS.
Reclaim their crown by crushing Alabama. Georgia on the mountaintop.
The national champions of college football in the year 2001. And they will claim at least a share of the national championship.
In college football, there have been 5 winning streaks that have equaled 29 wins or higher since the year 2000. And today, we're going to cover how those streaks were built and how those streaks ended. Starting with Florida State. Led by head coach Jimbo Fisher, the Florida State Seminoles went on a 29-game win streak starting in 2012. These teams featured the likes of 2013 Heisman winner Jameis Winston, jump ball wide receiver Kelvin Benjamin, elite running back Dalvin Cook, and to be honest, how about I show the whole roster from 2013 that featured a staggering amount of NFL starters like Devontae Freeman, LaMarcus Joyner, Ronald Darby, the list goes on. And not to mention, they had lost 11 players to the NFL the year before. And to really harp on how good 2013 Florida State was, they went 14-0 and won the ACC championship, won the BCS national championship, had a margin of victory of 39.5 points, put up 51.6 points per game, had the number 1 pass offense and number 3 total defense, and 23 players went on to be drafted. Their notable wins were a 63-0 shutout over top 25 Maryland, a 51-14 thrashing over number 3 Clemson, a 41-14 win over number 3 Miami, and a 34-31 comeback victory in the final BCS championship game in the Rose Bowl over number 2 Auburn, who it seemed always had a miracle up their sleeves. Looking at this 2013 season, you 100% see why Jimbo Fisher got that A&M contract, but getting back on track, things would come to a slow but inevitable end. Florida State had lost many key players in Kelvin Benjamin, LaMarcus Joyner, Timmy Jernigan, Terrence Brooks, Devontae Freeman, Christian Jones, you get the point. And oh boy was this season rough, but no matter how rough it got, they always found a way. But it was a complete flip of the switch from 2013, and the 2014 Florida State Seminoles went 13-0 in the regular season with a 8.1 margin of victory. They had the number 35 scoring offense, the number 98 rushing offense, the 14th passing offense, the 37th total defense. They were number 51 in points per game, 61st in pass defense, 73rd in rush defense, 62nd in total defense, and 115th in allowed points off turnovers. And an interesting stat, Jameis in first halves of the season had thrown 14 touchdowns to 13 interceptions. Yet they still won the ACC and found themselves in the newly formed college football playoff as the number 3 team in the country to defend their national championship. And that would set up their matchup with the number 2 team in the country, the Oregon Ducks, and Heisman Trophy winner Marcus Mariota. And many predicted this would be the game Florida State would simply run out of Houdini acts. They had escaped a staggering amount of games in a regular season. The major scares being a 21-point deficit to Louisville, a 16-point deficit to Miami, a 17-point deficit to NC State, and extremely close wins over Georgia Tech, Florida, Boston College, Clemson, and a controversial win over Notre Dame thanks to a pass interference call. So finally, let's get to the game, which of course would take place at the Rose Bowl where they won the national championship last year. And it's just something nostalgic about this game. It's the initial college football playoff, 2014 is coming to an end, new ESPN graphics, college Mariota and Jameis are on display in Pasadena, and Florida State would start out strong, forcing a 3-and-out. And Jameis led a field goal drive for the first points of the game, so no need to panic yet, a good start for the Noles. But then Oregon would fire back with a touchdown, and then go for 2 and convert for an 8-3 lead. And here we go. Florida State knew it'd be a back and forth affair, but they would respond with a punt. But this time the aggressiveness of Oregon would backfire. And on the next drive, we'd see the Florida State of old to reclaim the lead. Or at least, we thought. And this was a massive hit to Florida State's confidence. Oregon, even though they were backed up at the 1, marched 88 yards downfield before settling for a field goal. And already it was an 11-3 deficit. Florida State at least got 3 points to make it an 11-6 game, but since it's 2014 Florida State, you already knew Oregon would widen the game with a touchdown, making it 18-6, and putting the Noles down double digits for the 4th time this season. But with 36 seconds before half, a reeling Florida State would try to start their signature double-digit comeback, and maybe they were right where they wanted to be. It was 18-13 at half, with Florida State getting the ball to start the 3rd quarter, and this is where things would start to unravel for good. Dalvin Cook would fumble on what was a really good drive, and Mariota went right down the field for 6. The deficit was now 25-13. But don't worry, Florida State would have one last gasp to make it 25-20. But immediately, the Ducks lead jumped to 32-20, and 32-20 immediately became 39-20. And facing a 19-point deficit, this time against a well-oiled machine, reality had set in. They probably didn't have one more escape left in them. And then, the iconic famous Jameis play on 4th down that would forever be memed.
Ducks rush only 3. Winston has all day. Tries to escape, circles back, still alive. Loses the football, ball comes out. It's scooped up by the Ducks, and Tony Washington streaking to the end zone.
And before you could blink, the Noles were down 45-20. And just to show how bad things had gone, Jimbo was threatening to bench Jameis down 25 with a little over 16 minutes to go. And things will only get worse. The offense had gone completely frozen, and Jameis was picked off a drop pass, and the Noles had absolutely nothing left to give. Oregon won the 3rd quarter 27-7, and nothing would change in the 4th, as Oregon's onslaught had now resulted in half a hundred. It was 52-20 out of nowhere, and this game is obviously over, even with 13 minutes to go. So the last thing I'll cover is this fumble down 32 that just sums up the whole second half. This game was truly the end of a slow burn end of a 29-game win streak. One of the least surprising and more inevitable endings, and it's truly a miracle Florida State even made it to this game in the first place.
Lawrence picks up the blitz, delivers, and is in another circus catch by Ross. Wow!
Up next is the team that tied for the longest win streak in ACC history with the Florida State Seminoles, the Clemson Tigers. The Tigers fast-tracked to the top of college football when 5-star freshman sensation Trevor Lawrence took over for Kelly Bryant. During this win streak, Clemson was led by head coach Dabo Swinney, quarterback Trevor Lawrence, running back Travis Etienne, wide receivers T. Higgins and Justin Ross, linebacker Isaiah Simmons, cornerback AJ Terrell, and defensive tackle Christian Wilkins. And there is one common theme about this team and our next team, and that's Alabama. This was the time where you already knew it was going to be Cavs and Warriors in the NBA Finals and Clemson Alabama in the National Championship. Clemson would lose to Alabama 24-6 on January 1st, 2018 in the college football playoff semifinal at the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans. And this stadium would be Trevor Lawrence's kryptonite. But it wasn't Trevor who started that game. It'd be Kelly Bryant, who was the bridge quarterback between Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence. Clemson quarterback Kelly Bryant was 18 of 36 for 124 yards and 2 interceptions in the loss, after leading the Tigers to a 12-1 record in the regular season. Freshman Trevor Lawrence took over for Bryant after the 4th game of the 2018 season, and that train would keep on rolling, including a national championship win versus, of course, Alabama. And this was a dominant showing. Number 2 Clemson defeated number 1 Alabama 44-16. Trevor Lawrence completed 20 of 32 passes for 347 yards and 3 touchdowns. And of the 9 receivers he connected with, Justin Ross was his favorite, as the wideout amassed 153 yards and a score on 6 catches. And keep in mind, Ross was just a true freshman. Clemson would look to repeat in 2019, but instead of it being Alabama, they faced a team that took down Alabama, 2019 LSU. By the time we got to this game, Clemson's streak had reached that magic number of 29. A remarkable run led by head coach Dabo Swinney and sophomore quarterback Trevor Lawrence, who is now 25-0 as a starter with the Tigers. Clemson averaged 44.8 points per game and allowed just 12.3 points per game in these last 29 games. The Tigers had beaten those opponents by an average margin of 32.4 points per game, and 10 of Clemson's victories had been by more than 40 points per game. The Tigers were 7-0 against top 25 teams through the 29-game win streak, and that includes 4 regular season games and 3 college football playoff semifinals. But the most notable game in this streak was win number 29 against Ohio State. It was the PlayStation Fiesta Bowl to punch their ticket to meet the Bayou Bengals on January 13th. And in one of the greatest showdowns ever, the back and forth affair would forever be known as the game the refs took from Ohio State. With a little under 5 minutes to go in the third of a 21-16 ball game, Lawrence would target Justin Ross, and Ohio State corner Jeff Okudah would knock the ball out in the early stages of the catch. And the Ohio State Buckeyes would pick up the ball and run it back for 6. It looked like the Buckeyes had taken all the momentum, but moments later, the refs would review the play and rule it an incomplete pass. And this is just one of a ton of notable calls against the Buckeyes. There are whole 10-minute videos highlighting the calls from this game, and it remains one of the more controversial games of all time. And that would lead us to the showdown versus 2019 LSU. Unstoppable force meets immovable object. But this game would take place in the place that Trevor Lawrence could never overcome his whole career, the Superdome. Trevor Lawrence, who never lost a game, versus what might be the greatest offense of all time with the Heisman Trophy winner. And Clemson had a strong start, forcing a punt and scoring first with Trevor Lawrence running into the end zone for 6. But LSU would respond later in the first with a deep ball to Ja'Marr Chase to tie it at 7. Clemson's kicker then nailed a career-long 52-yard field goal to take the lead. And Clemson's defense was dominating early on, which gave their offense a chance to stretch the lead to 10. And for a moment, it seemed LSU was in trouble. They had never faced a deficit like this and so early into the game. But Joe Burrow knew to go to old reliable. And Ja'Marr Chase one-on-one again would get them inside the 10, and Burrow would finish off the drive with his legs. And then with a chance to take the lead, Justin Jefferson got in on the action. And of course, Ja'Marr Chase's monster game continued, adding his second touchdown. And once LSU got the lead, they never looked back. Thaddeus Moss got a touchdown to conclude a 95-yard drive right before half to go up 11. But Clemson wasn't done fighting yet. They'd scored to open the second half, but LSU of course had an answer. But Clemson had no answers for Ja'Marr Chase, who would get into the red zone where Moss would finish off the drive. And now LSU was taking turns in spreading the wealth to all their receivers. Terrence Marshall delivered the knockout punch, and out of nowhere, LSU had taken a 42-25 lead. And not once had Clemson been in this position under Trevor Lawrence. And with the game basically over, Grant Delpit would force the ball out of Trevor Lawrence's hands, and that would officially mark the end of Trevor Lawrence and Clemson's undefeated streak. And of course, Trevor's Clemson career ended a year later when Ohio State got revenge for the events of the year before, and it happened in the same building where Clemson lost their undefeated streak. Trevor's only 2 losses in his entire collegiate career were in the Superdome.
Celebrating back-to-back, man. You do not see this in college football.
The Georgia Bulldogs bludgeoned their way to back-to-back.
15-0, the Dogs have done it and won a second consecutive national title.
Led by Kirby Smart, the Georgia Bulldogs also went on a 29-game win streak starting on December 31st, 2021 in their Orange Bowl college football playoff defeat of the Michigan Wolverines. But it must be noted that this streak would have been even longer if it wasn't for the Alabama Crimson Tide. The Tide seemed to just have a mental chokehold over the Dogs. We can go as far back as the 2012 SEC Championship game to look at big games where the Tide have come out on top. And then moving into the Kirby Smart era, where the Tide really have showcased their mental chokehold over the Dogs, starting with the iconic 2017 National Championship game. The Dogs' defense was dominant. Alabama couldn't move the ball down the field, which led to a 13-0 halftime deficit. But when Saban pulled Jalen Hurts for the true freshman Tua Tagovailoa to start the second half, the Tide mounted a comeback and forced overtime. And in one of the more sickening stats that you could ever see if you're a Georgia fan, Georgia led 21-10 in the third quarter of that 2012 SEC Championship game. And here, they led 20-10 after 3 in the 2017 National Championship game. And you already know how this one ended. The Tide lined up for 2nd and 26 and the rest is history. Funny enough, Georgia's lone regular season loss was to an Alabama team in Auburn, and their national championship loss was of course to Alabama. Now we move on to 2018, and Georgia once again found themselves matched up with Alabama for the SEC championship. And once again, Georgia built a lead, this one being 28-14 early in the third quarter. And then in the most sick and reverse scenario ever, it's Jalen Hurts coming into the game to take over for the injured Tua, and Jalen now leads a fourth quarter comeback as the Tide won 35-28, outscoring Georgia 21-0 in the last 28 minutes of play. Absolutely heartbreaking. The 2019 Georgia Bulldogs avoided Alabama, but unfortunately for them, they'd have to go up against the behemoth 2019 LSU team that took down Alabama. And we all know how that went. So now on to 2020, where they'd meet second-ranked Alabama in their 4th game of the regular season. And they'd fall victim again to the Tide like so many others would in that 2020 season. So in total, under Kirby Smart, Georgia was 0-3 against Alabama. But now we meet the team that would change that. The team that would finally get over their demons. Over this run, they'd go on for the next 3 years. The main contributors were Stetson Bennett, Zamir White, James Cook, George Pickens, Jermaine Burton, Brock Bowers, A.D. Mitchell, Jordan Davis, Nakobe Dean, Trayvon Walker, I can go on. And over the course of the regular season, the Dogs would go undefeated, including key wins over number 3 Clemson, number 8 Arkansas, number 18 Auburn, and number 11 Kentucky. But of course, they'd meet the one team they couldn't beat. Alabama. And this was a desperate Alabama. They were the number 3 team in the country thanks to LSU, but a second loss would for sure keep them out the playoff. And Bryce Young would respond with a performance for the ages. 421 passing yards, 40 yards rushing, 3 passing touchdowns, and 1 rushing touchdown in a flawless performance for the Heisman Trophy winner. And once again, it just seemed Alabama had Georgia's number. Make that 4-0 now for Saban against Kirby. But not all was lost because again, Georgia was the 1 seed, so they had a large margin for error. And now they'd make the playoff as the 3 seed and Bama the 1. But before they could meet up with Alabama, they'd meet and demolish the Michigan Wolverines in the game that would mark the official start of the streak. Or was it? Because just like 4 years before, Georgia found themselves matched up with Alabama for the national championship. And this would be a back and forth defensive affair. Alabama headed to the locker room at half up 9-6, but the lone third quarter score went the Bulldogs' way, giving them a 13-9 lead entering the fourth quarter. Then Alabama scored on their next 2 drives, making it an 18-13 lead with 10 minutes to go. And now, the Bulldogs would once again have to look their demons in the eye, but would they fold or extract revenge? They chose the latter. And in a reverse of the 2018 SEC Championship game, Georgia went on their own 21-0 run and sealed it with a Keely Ringo interception to close the national championship. And finally, they had beaten Alabama. And they'd go undefeated in 2022 en route to the biggest blowout bowl win ever versus TCU in the 2022 National Championship. But let's not forget what maybe was the greatest playoff game ever to get to that game. And now we can take some time to backtrack. Since the 2021 season began, Georgia's only loss was that 2021 SEC Championship game, which had they won would have made their streak 34 games entering the 2023 season. Keep in mind, they'd go undefeated during the 2023 regular season. But let's backtrack. Opening night, they'd have Carson Beck taking the reins for Stetson Bennett, and the wheels would continue to turn for the Dogs. As I mentioned earlier, undefeated in the regular season, and once again, they'd find themselves matched up with Alabama. But one problem, this time even as the 1 seed, if they lost, they were out. And with the actual win streak sitting at 29, the Dogs will go to war one last time with Nick Saban. And just like old times, Georgia would struggle with the tide. And in this game, Georgia was the overwhelming favorite. Alabama was seen as the team on their last gasp. After losing to Texas, barely beating UCF, and struggling versus Auburn, needing a last-second miracle in the Iron Bowl. But yet, they'd still lead 17-7 at half thanks to the controversial catch-no catch. And in the late stages of the third, it seemed Georgia had officially given the game away. Trailing by 7 backed up in their own territory, they turned the ball over, giving Alabama prime field position. But the Dogs' defense held strong and forced a field goal. Now trailing 20-10, there were 15 minutes left to save their streak and playoff hopes. And things were looking good, as Georgia would score quick, making it a 3-point game. And then, the Isaiah Bond drive. He torched the defense en route to a Bama touchdown, making every critical catch needed. And for the first time since last year's Peach Bowl, the streak was in serious danger. But never had there been this little time to mount a comeback. And with less than 5 minutes to go, Georgia would do their part offensively. But now with just 2:52 left in the game, the defense would have to make a stop. But just like Jalen Hurts many years before, Georgia couldn't stop the legs of Jalen Milroe. And that was it. The 29-game win streak had come to an end. Of course, to no other than the team they couldn't overcome, Alabama. But hey, at least they got their 1 win versus Alabama in the national championship.
I'm hurt, dog. Don't ask me if I'm all right. Hell no. Joaquin said dominate, and we not doing it. I'm putting my heart in this dog. Let's go, man. Let's go, baby. Let's go.
Up next, we have the 2000 to 2003 Miami Hurricanes. Talk about a team with talent across the board. To some, this is the greatest team to ever lace up the cleats in college football. They were led by the likes of Ed Reed, Sean Taylor, Santana Moss, Reggie Wayne, Clinton Portis, Jeremy Shockey, Ken Dorsey, Willis McGahee, Andre Johnson, Vince Wilfork, Jonathan Vilma, Frank Gore, and many more. Miami had many victories against ranked teams, like in 2000 when they beat number 2 Virginia Tech, led by Michael Vick, knocking him out the game and shattering their BCS championship hopes. Other teams include their state rival, the Florida State Seminoles, where the third iteration of the famed wide right game would take place. Nearly blowing a 17-0 lead, Miami would escape by the skin of their teeth. Florida State also gave the Canes a run for their money in 2002, a 13-point fourth quarter comeback, this time led by Miami, that would give them a 28-27 lead, where of course, like so many other games in the rivalry, it ended on a missed field goal. And of course, we have to make quick mention of the mauling Miami put on Nebraska in the Rose Bowl, a program-changing loss in the BCS championship, as Nebraska hasn't been legit national championship contenders since. But how did it all come to an end? Going for the repeat, this time they'd meet the Ohio State Buckeyes in the Fiesta Bowl. And what would go down as one of, if not the most controversial game of all time, let us set the stage. 34-game win streak, the first major win streak in this century, going up against the undefeated Ohio State Buckeyes, who were an 11.5-point underdog. 13-0 versus 12-0. Keith Jackson on the call. The game had all the makings of a coronation of the Canes, or the throning by the Buckeyes. Miami got out the blocks first. Ken Dorsey fired a touchdown to Kellen Winslow, which would be followed by an Ohio State interception to Sean Taylor. Then Dorsey would lose his composure and throw a pick of his own. Seeing the stakes at hand, Ohio State would fail a fake field goal attempt, but no harm was caused because Ken Dorsey threw the ball right back to Ohio State. And they'd find the end zone for the first time, tying it at 7. Dorsey was then strip sacked and Ohio State recovered and eventually ran it in for a touchdown. Things were getting grim for Miami. Dorsey was having the worst game of his career. Through 2 quarters, he'd been picked off twice and lost a fumble. And then when things looked like they'd get out of reach, one of the iconic plays in the history of the championship game would take place. On a throw to the end zone, Miami's Sean Taylor intercepted the ball. But on his return, he'd then be stripped by Ohio State's Maurice Clarett, the sensational true freshman starting running back. And that would lead to a very important 3 points to give Ohio State a 17-7 lead. Then, it'd be the Willis McGahee show. Willis would find the end zone and cut the lead down to 3. And it seemed every time he touched the ball, plays were being made. And now Miami found their rhythm. This was the team that walked into Tempe on a 34-game win streak. And then, disaster struck. With 11:39 to go in the fourth quarter, star running back Willis McGahee tore 2 different ligaments in his knee, his MCL and his ACL. And with the game in balance, it'd now be up to the rest of the team to keep this streak alive. And on Miami's best drive since the first quarter, it ended in a devastating fumble. Was this it? Did they lose their chance? The vaunted Miami defense forced a stop, and with 2 minutes to go, there was a chance. And that chance turned into elite field position as Antrell Roll returned it inside the 30. But Ohio State's defense stood tall, and with 3 seconds to go, Miami would have a 40-yard field goal attempt to force overtime. And he nailed it. But the play that gets lost in this entire fiasco of a game is a non-called pass interference when Chris Gamble's jersey was tugged on Ohio State's final drive in regulation. Keep in mind, had this been called, Ohio State gets a free first down, and Miami more likely than not wouldn't have gotten the ball back in position to do anything, meaning no game-tying field goal and no overtime. But it wasn't called, and now we're here. Miami struck first in overtime, number 1, and now it was Ohio State's turn to respond. And on 4th and 3 with the game in the balance, Craig Krenzel would target Chris Gamble in the end zone, and the pass would fall incomplete. Miami had survived, the national champions, for the 2nd time in a row, until they weren't. With Miami players storming the field and feeling the highest of highs, a pass interference flag was thrown. And with all the angles we have, I do think pass interference by rule was the right call, but the controversy here is the fact that it was a delayed flag. I'd like to know you guys' opinions in the comments below, but also knowing that Miami got away with a tug in regulation, it also makes the flag easier to digest. Of course, Ohio State will go on to score back-to-back touchdowns with the true freshman Clarett diving into the end zone to go up 7 in overtime number 2. And with Miami's back against the wall, things weren't looking too bad. They had got themselves the 1st and goal and had 4 plays to save their win streak and roll the BCS for the 2nd year in a row. But remember what happened at the beginning of the 4th quarter. With no Willis McGahee, the Hurricanes' offense sputtered just 4 yards away from the end zone, and that was it. In one of the more controversial games you'll ever see, Ohio State defeated what many still call the greatest team of all time, ending their streak at 34 and claiming their first national championship since 1968.
And they throw the bush. Look out! Look out! Here comes the pursuit. Irish defender missed him, and Bush is in the end zone. Touchdown.
From September 28, 2003 to January 1, 2006, under the guidance of head coach Pete Carroll, the USC Trojans went on a 34-game win streak. This star-studded Hollywood team featured the likes of Heisman Trophy winner Reggie Bush, Heisman Trophy winner Matt Leinart, Lindell White, Steve Smith, Mike Williams, and many more players who'd go on to be drafted. This win streak featured major victories over Auburn, Cal, UCLA, a Rose Bowl win versus Michigan, which they used to claim their 2003 AP National Championship, and then in 2004 they'd become the undisputed national champions in the BCS Championship at the Orange Bowl, beating Oklahoma. And those were very important wins in keeping the streak alive, but those games were also dominating showings for the Trojans, because the streak was never in more danger than October 15th, 2005, when the Trojans of Southern Cal would face their rivals the Notre Dame Fighting Irish in South Bend. And no, this would not be the game the streak ended, but oh boy was it close. SC trailed 31-28 with one final shot at keeping the streak alive, and on 4th and 9 for everything, Matt Leinart dropped back to pass and would loft a last hope prayer to Dwayne Jarrett, who only had one eye functioning, and he hauled it in. And that would set the stage for one of the most iconic plays in college football history. Matt Leinart fumbled the ball flew out of bounds, and there was no time on the clock, and it seemed the game was over. The streak was over, but it wasn't. After review, the Trojans would have one more play. Matt Leinart took the snap and attempted to run the ball into the end zone. And as he was being tackled, Reggie Bush pushed Leinart from behind to help him across the end zone. Leinart scored, giving USC a 34-31 lead with just seconds remaining. The quote-unquote Bush push was a highly controversial play, as it appeared to involve an illegal act of assisting the runner. Under NCAA rules, assisting the runner is prohibited, and the play should have resulted in a penalty. However, the officials did not penalize USC for the play, and the touchdown stood. And thanks to the Bush push, the streak was now at 28. They go through the rest of the season unfazed, and we all knew who their final test would be. From the preseason to the moment the national championship kicked off, USC was ranked number 1 and Texas was ranked number 2. A wire-to-wire season in the polls. Texas in the previous season played their final game right where this national championship would be taking place, the Rose Bowl. Texas, thanks to the greatness of Vince Young, had put away the Michigan Wolverines in one of the greatest Rose Bowl performances ever. And VY after the game said,
Yes, sir, we'll be back. Yes, sir.
Talk about setting the stage. But in week 2, the Horns would face their biggest test of the season. They'd have to go into the Horseshoe and meet the 4th-ranked Ohio State Buckeyes. And in one of the all-time great classics, Ohio State left the door open for Vince Young to be Vince Young. And he'd find Lima Swede in the corner of the end zone to put the dagger in Ohio State. And from that point on, it was inevitable that it'd be SC in Texas. And adding even more drama to this game, Reggie Bush would be chosen to win the 2005 Heisman Trophy over Vince Young. And Vince felt slighted. He had an even larger chip on his shoulder. And this now meant the last 2 Heisman Trophy winners and the Heisman runner-up would be on the same field in Pasadena. But not just Vince felt slighted, the whole Texas team felt disrespected. The media coverage from this game felt like it was the coronation of USC as the greatest team of all time. Before the game, ESPN ran a segment putting USC as the greatest team in the history of college football. But the time for talk was over. It was now time for the Clash of the Titans. Would it be 3 straight for SC or Texas first since 1970? And Texas would have the best start they could ask for, forcing a 3-and-out, but they'd immediately give the ball back, fumbling on the punt return. This would be SC's 189th forced turnover since 2001, which obviously led the NCAA. The Trojans would take advantage of the field position and strike for 6, but my goodness what a hit. Texas would fail to respond, failing a 4th-and-1 attempt, and it looked like we were in the early stages of a rout, but SC would fail their own 4th-and-1. The rest of the first quarter would be a defensive affair, which led us into the beginning of the second, where Reggie Bush would try to do it all. He lateraled the ball to his teammate on an already big gain where Walker wasn't even expecting the ball. And the early story of this game was the turnovers on both sides, keeping the game at 7-0. And the Horns would finally take advantage by putting 3 on the board. And when it seemed the Trojans would at least match the 3 points, Michael Griffin made an incredible interception on an end zone throw to Steve Smith, which would lead to the controversial Vince Young pitching to Sheldon Young. Vince Young did what Reggie couldn't do, but the difference is Young's knee was 100% on the ground, and somehow Texas got away with it. Texas missed the extra point, but all that mattered is they got the touchdown and somehow avoided a replay review, which is ironic because a replay review is what gave Texas the interception on the drive before. Texas then built upon their lead, and shockingly, the Trojans trailed 16-7 with 2.5 to go until halftime. In this long 34-game win streak, SC had only trailed 7 times at half. This time, it'd be 16-10 after an almost disaster of a pick was dropped, leading to a field goal. Southern Cal then came out firing to start the second half, and the two teams traded touchdowns. And on 4th and 11, trailing 23-17, the Trojans wouldn't be denied this time, taking back their 1-point lead 24-23. And the third quarter would end with a missed field goal, which gave SC the ball and a chance to add to their lead. And this is where Reggie Bush would have one of college football's most iconic plays, diving into the end zone. The Heisman Trophy finalists were sure making plays tonight, as Young would lead a field goal drive, cutting the score to 31-26. And in one of the craziest catches ever, SC would put on the proverbial icing on the cake, as they had done so many times before. Vince Young was now looking at a 38-26 deficit with just 6:42 to go. But Mr. Invincible would show up once again, making the defense of the #1 team in the country look like high schoolers. And once again, SC faced a 4th and 2, and in a decision to keep the Heisman Trophy winner Reggie Bush off the field, SC's Lindell White failed to pick up the yards, and the door was left open for Vince Young. And you already know, the rest is history.
4th and 5, the national championship on the line right here. He's going for the corner. He's got it. Vince Young scores.